Pennsylvania has more abandoned places than most states care to admit. Old asylums, flooded towns, collapsed mines, and hospitals that closed their doors but never quite emptied out. Some of them have histories that got buried along with everything else. Here are the 12 abandoned places in Pennsylvania that hide disturbing secrets. Number 12, Pennhurst State School and Hospital, Spring City. Pennhurst opened in 1908 in Spring City, Chester County, under the official name Eastern Pennsylvania State Institution for the Feeble-Minded and Epileptic. That name alone tells you a great deal about the era's attitude toward the people housed there. By the time it closed in 1987, Pennhurst had become one of the most notorious institutions in American history, not because of what it was supposed to do, but because of what it actually did. The facility was built to house roughly 1,400 people. By the 1960s, it was holding close to 3,000. The residents included people with intellectual disabilities, mental illness, physical disabilities, and in a number of documented cases, individuals who had been committed simply because their families did not want them. Staff was chronically underpaid and drastically understaffed. The conditions that resulted were not accidental. They were the predictable outcome of a system that warehoused human beings rather than treated them. In 1968, television journalist Bill Baldini aired a 5-part investigative series called Suffer the Little Children, which took hidden cameras inside Pennhurst and showed Pennsylvania and the rest of the country exactly what was happening. Viewers saw residents left in their own waste, physically restrained for extended periods, and existing in conditions that fell well below any reasonable definition of care. The public response was immediate and sustained. Baldini later said he had never received more mail about any story in his career. The expose led to a landmark federal lawsuit, Halderman versus Pennhurst State School and Hospital, which ultimately produced a consent decree requiring community-based care for people with disabilities. It was one of the most significant disability rights cases in American legal history. The buildings still stand in Spring City, operating now as a seasonal haunted attraction, which, depending on your perspective, is either a fitting second act or the most uncomfortable irony in Pennsylvania real estate. Former residents and disability rights advocates have raised objections to the haunted attraction use for years, arguing that staging theatrical horror in a place where real people experienced genuine suffering is not a neutral choice. The operators have argued that keeping the buildings accessible and publicly visible honors the history rather than erasing it. That debate has never been cleanly resolved. What is beyond debate is what Pennhurst was, what happened inside it, and the fact that it operated that way for the better part of 8 decades before anyone with a camera walked through the door. Number 11, Centralia, Columbia County. Centralia is the most famous ghost town in Pennsylvania and quite possibly the most famous in the United States, which is a distinction the roughly handful of remaining residents probably do not celebrate. The town sits in Columbia County, and beneath it, a coal mine fire has been burning continuously since 1962. The fire started, depending on which account you accept, either when the Borough Council hired contractors to burn the town landfill, which was situated in an abandoned strip mine pit, and the fire worked its way into an exposed coal vein, or when the fire was already smoldering from an earlier incident and the landfill burning simply accelerated it. Either way, it was burning before anyone realized it was burning, and by the time they did, it was too late. Over the following decades, the ground above the fire became unstable. Carbon monoxide levels in homes reached dangerous concentrations. In 1981, a 12-year-old named Todd Domboski fell through a sinkhole that opened beneath his feet in his own backyard. The hole was 4 feet wide and dropped approximately 150 feet into a superheated void filled with carbon monoxide. He survived only because his cousin grabbed him. The federal government eventually allocated funds to relocate residents, and most accepted. A few did not. Pennsylvania condemned the properties and eventually revoked Centralia's zip code in 2002. The fire is still burning. Geologists estimate it could continue for another 250 years. Steam rises from cracks in the abandoned roads. The remaining residents, estimated at fewer than 10, live on land the state technically owns. The town's church was demolished. The cemetery remains. Number 10. Eastern State Penitentiary, Philadelphia. Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia opened in 1829 and operated for 142 years, closing in 1971. In that time, it held over 75,000 inmates and pioneered a system of solitary confinement so influential that it was copied by prisons across Europe and studied by governments worldwide. The system was called the Pennsylvania system, and its core principle was that total isolation from other human beings, including, in the early decades, covering inmates' heads with hoods anytime they left their cells, would produce reflection, penitence, and rehabilitation. What it produced instead, in a large number of cases, was psychological breakdown. The Quaker reformers who designed the system believed genuinely in its humanitarian intent. Charles Dickens, who visited Eastern State in 1842, did not share their assessment. He wrote that the solitary confinement practiced there was a punishment that inflicted torment on the mind that no man had the right to inflict on another, regardless of the crime. For a Victorian-era English novelist to describe an American prison as excessively cruel is a fairly strong signal that something had gone wrong. Notable inmates included Al Capone, who served 8 months there in 1929 and 1930 on a weapons charge, and Willie Sutton, the bank robber who escaped from the prison in 1945 through a tunnel his group had been digging for a year. The tunnel collapsed before all the escapees cleared it, and all were eventually recaptured. The prison today operates as a historic site and museum, and it is one of the best preserved examples of 19th century Gothic Revival institutional architecture in the country. The cell blocks that have been left to deteriorate rather than restored are particularly striking: peeling paint, collapsed ceilings, vegetation growing through the floors. Whether you find that beautiful or unsettling probably depends on whether you have ever spent time in solitary confinement. What Eastern State also holds, less discussed than the architecture or the famous inmates, is an accounting problem. The Pennsylvania system was exported globally. Prisons across Europe, South America, and Asia adopted the solitary confinement model after delegations visited Eastern State and returned home convinced. The full extent of psychological damage that model produced across all the institutions that adopted it and all the people who passed through them has never been meaningfully tallied. Eastern State itself is a museum now, open to the public, offering guided tours of the deteriorating cell blocks. The solitary confinement cells are about the size of a standard parking space. Number 9. Byberry Mental Hospital, Philadelphia. Philadelphia State Hospital at Byberry operated from 1907 to 1990 and managed, over those 8 decades, to become one of the most comprehensively horrifying institutions in Pennsylvania history, which, given the competition, is not a small achievement. Byberry, as it was universally called, was a public psychiatric hospital that spent most of its existence dramatically overcrowded, criminally underfunded, and largely hidden from public scrutiny. In 1946, conscientious objectors assigned to Byberry as alternative service during World War II smuggled photographs and accounts of conditions inside the hospital to journalist Albert Deutsch. His subsequent reporting and the photographs showed patients lying naked on bare floors, covered in their own waste, in overcrowded wards where violence was routine and staff supervision was minimal at best. The exposé contributed to the broader post-war reckoning with American psychiatric institutions that eventually led to deinstitutionalization policies decades later. What makes Byberry particularly grim is the timeline. The 1946 exposé produced outrage and promises of reform. 40 years later, when Byberry closed in 1990, investigators found conditions that, in certain respects, were barely improved. The state eventually demolished most of the buildings, though demolition workers reportedly found human remains on the grounds during the process. Some structures stood long enough to become destinations for urban explorers who documented conditions inside the abandoned buildings that included intact patient records, discarded medical equipment, and evidence of the physical restraint systems that had been standard practice. One of the more uncomfortable facts about Byberry is that at its peak population in the 1950s, it held well over 6,000 patients in facilities designed for a fraction of that number. Staff ratios were so inadequate that meaningful supervision was impossible in many wards, and violence between patients, and between staff and patients, was a documented feature of daily life rather than an aberration. When deinstitutionalization policy eventually began moving patients out into community care settings in the 1970s and 1980s, a large number of those community settings did not exist in any meaningful form. Patients were discharged into circumstances that, in some cases, were not substantially better than what they had left. The site is now a residential development. The history is under the subdivisions. Number 8. Concrete City, Nanticoke. In 1911, the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Coal Company built 20 double houses in Nanticoke, Luzerne County, for its miners and their families. The houses were constructed entirely from poured concrete, walls, floors, ceilings, stairs, and all. The company called the development Concrete City, which may be the least imaginative name in the history of American company housing, but it was at least accurate. The concrete construction was intended to be fireproof and durable. It was both. It was also, by most accounts, bitterly cold in winter, unpleasantly damp, and acoustically unforgiving. Residents could hear everything happening in the adjacent unit. The company abandoned the development in 1924, relocating its workers, when it determined that the maintenance costs were higher than expected and the location was no longer ideal for mining operations. What the company left behind was 40 units of perfectly intact, if thoroughly uninhabitable, poured concrete housing sitting in the middle of the woods. For a century, Concrete City has been used as a dumping ground, a canvas for graffiti artists, a target for people who apparently find shooting at concrete an enjoyable weekend activity, and a destination for urban explorers. The company's attempts to demolish the buildings in the 1990s failed. Dynamite and a wrecking ball both proved insufficient to bring down the structures. They are still standing. They will probably outlast most of what surrounds them. Nanticoke eventually moved to acquire the site for preservation, recognizing that accidental indestructibility is a form of historical significance. The secrets Concrete City hides are not supernatural. They are the more ordinary kind. The history of American company housing is a history of workers who had limited bargaining power over where they lived, who owned the building they slept in, or what happened to their home if the company decided to move on. The families of Concrete City did not own their homes. They were tenants of the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Coal Company, which means that when the company decided in 1924 that the location was no longer convenient, the decision about whether to stay was not theirs to make. The buildings that were supposed to house them permanently still stand, empty and indestructible, while the community that lived in them scattered and disappeared. Number 7. Rockview Penitentiary's Execution Chamber, Bellefonte. State Correctional Institution at Rockview in Centre County is still an operating prison, but it contains within it the remnants of a history that Pennsylvania has been quietly moving away from for decades. Rockview was the site of Pennsylvania's execution chamber from 1915 until the state abolished the electric chair in 1990 in favor of lethal injection, and it remained the designated execution facility until Pennsylvania imposed a moratorium on executions in 1990, a moratorium that has never been lifted. From 1915 to 1962, Rockview carried out 350 executions by electric chair. The chair itself, known informally as Old Smoky, is no longer at the facility, but the chamber where those executions took place still exists within the prison's structure. The history attached to that room, who sat in it, under what circumstances, and what errors may have been made in the process, is a history Pennsylvania has largely preferred not to examine closely. The moratorium was imposed by Governor Robert Casey in 1990 while reviewing the case of a death row inmate, and has been maintained by every subsequent governor regardless of political affiliation. There are currently several dozen people on death row in Pennsylvania who have been there for decades. The execution chamber at Rockview sits unused, technically preserved, a piece of infrastructure maintained for a function the state has not performed in over 3 decades and shows no current indication of resuming. Number 6. The ghostly town of Alvira, Union County. Alvira in Union County was not abandoned in the slow, economic way that most American small towns fade. It was emptied on purpose, quickly, by the federal government in 1942. The United States Army needed the land for a munitions depot during World War II. The roughly 200 families living in Alvira were given little time and modest compensation and told to leave. They left, and the Army built its depot. The munitions plant operated through the war and was decommissioned afterward. The land was eventually transferred to the Pennsylvania Game Commission, which manages it today as a wildlife area. What remained after the military left were the concrete bunkers where munitions had been stored, approximately 188 of them, scattered across the landscape in various states of deterioration, along with the foundations of the homes and buildings of the original town. Walking through Alvira today means walking past the concrete steps that once led to front porches, the outlines of foundations in the undergrowth, and the rusting remnants of a town that was legally erased within a matter of weeks. The bunkers are the most visually striking feature. Low, grass-covered concrete structures in long rows that look from a distance like a series of burial mounds. Some of them are sealed. The contents of others, and the full environmental assessment of the soil on the former depot grounds, have been subjects of ongoing study. The displacement of Alvira's families was part of a pattern that occurred at multiple sites across the United States during World War II. Communities acquired by eminent domain with compensation that, in most documented cases, fell well short of the actual market value of the properties taken. The families had no meaningful legal recourse. The urgency of wartime mobilization was real, and the argument for prioritizing military needs over individual property rights in a national emergency has a reasonable basis. What is harder to justify is the subsequent history. The land was never returned, never redeveloped for civilian use, and the compensation offered was never revisited. Families whose ancestors were displaced from Alvira have maintained a historical society and hold annual memorial gatherings at the site. The government never came back to rebuild what it took. Number 5. The Western State Penitentiary, Pittsburgh. Western State Penitentiary in Pittsburgh opened in 1882 on the north side of the city, replacing an earlier facility that had itself been built using the Pennsylvania system of solitary confinement. The new prison was designed to be more humane. The word humane, in the context of 19th century American incarceration, was doing a great deal of work. By the 20th century, Western State was substantially overcrowded and had accumulated a history of documented abuse, riots, and administrative failures. A serious riot in 1921 resulted in significant damage to the facility. The prison operated through multiple eras of reform and retrenchment, closing finally in 2005 when the state opened a newer facility nearby. The building sat vacant for years before being partially converted, with the main structure remaining largely untouched. Urban explorers who accessed the abandoned sections documented intact cell blocks, administrative records left behind, and the physical geography of a working penitentiary preserved at the moment of closure. Western State also holds a distinction that tends not to appear on historical plaques. It was the site of executions carried out in a manner that Pennsylvania's own investigators later found troubling. The transition periods between different execution methods, from hanging to electrocution, were managed at facilities like Western State, with a degree of improvisation that did not always produce the outcomes officially described. Records from early 20th century executions at Pennsylvania facilities document botched procedures that were not publicly reported at the time. Pittsburgh is a city that has reinvented itself multiple times over, and the Western Penitentiary site represents one of its more contested reinvention debates. What to do with a large, historically significant, architecturally notable building whose history makes straightforward celebration complicated. Number 4. Ohiopyle Tunnel and the abandoned B and O Railroad Corridor, Fayette County. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad's corridor through Fayette County, including the tunnel near Ohiopyle, represents a particular kind of Pennsylvania abandonment, the kind left by industry that was once so dominant it seemed permanent. The B&O line through this region was carved through some of the most rugged terrain in the Allegheny Mountains in the 19th century, and the infrastructure built to support it, tunnels, viaducts, stone retaining walls, was built to last. The railroad eventually ceased operations through this corridor, and the right-of-way was converted in part to recreational trail use. The tunnel near Ohiopyle, however, sits outside the managed trail system and has been left in its original state. It is long enough that no natural light penetrates the middle section, and the stone and brick lining has been deteriorating for decades without maintenance. The experience of walking into it is not recommended for anyone who needs things like structural assessments before proceeding. What the tunnel and the abandoned corridor more broadly hide are the human costs of the railroad construction era. The workers who built this infrastructure through the Allegheny Mountains were largely Irish and Eastern European immigrants, recruited with the promise of wages and delivered to some of the most physically brutal working conditions in 19th century American industry. Explosives, hand tools, and raw terrain claimed lives at rates that were considered acceptable losses by the companies directing the work. Documented fatalities from the construction of Pennsylvania's railroad network number in the hundreds. The actual figure, accounting for unreported deaths among immigrant workers who had no family in the region to file reports, is almost certainly higher. In several locations along Pennsylvania's historic rail corridors, workers who died on the job were buried near the work site, not in marked graves in established cemeteries, but in expedient burial locations along the right-of-way. Some of these sites have been identified through historical research, others have not. The trails and tunnels are used today by hikers and cyclists who, quite reasonably, enjoy the landscape. The labor history beneath their feet is largely unmarked. Number 3. The abandoned village of Pithole, Venango County. Pithole, in Venango County, went from wilderness to a city of 15,000 people and back to wilderness in approximately 3 years. This is not a metaphor or an exaggeration. In January 1865, Pithole Creek was an uninhabited stretch of forest. By the following September, Pithole City had a population of 15,000, 57 hotels, 3 churches, a daily newspaper, and a pipeline. One of the first oil pipelines in American history, running to a railroad connection. By 1870, it was essentially empty. The cause was oil. Pithole sat in the heart of the Pennsylvania oil rush that followed Edwin Drake's 1859 well at nearby Titusville. The wells at Pithole produced enormous quantities of oil, attracted enormous quantities of people and capital, and then declined with a speed that matched their rise. As the oil ran out, the population left. Buildings were dismantled and moved to other boomtowns. The land was eventually sold at a tax auction in 1878 for $4.37. The entire former city. Today, the Pithole City Historic Site is managed by the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. Visitors walk a mowed field with numbered markers indicating where major buildings once stood. There are no standing structures. There is no visible evidence of the city except the markers and the irregular topography left by old foundations and cellar holes. The visitor center contains photographs and artifacts. It is a genuinely affecting place, not because of anything dramatic, but because the scale of what happened here and the completeness of its erasure are both difficult to fully absorb. The disturbing dimension of Pithole that the historic markers do not fully address is the environmental damage. The Pennsylvania oil rush of the 1860s introduced large-scale petroleum extraction to North America with essentially no environmental regulation. Oil Creek and its tributaries were heavily contaminated during the boom years. Tank fires, spills, and the routine practice of dumping waste oil directly into waterways were standard. The 1866 Oil Creek flood, caused partly by a dam failure upstream, sent a wall of oil-contaminated water through the region that killed over 50 people and destroyed millions of dollars in property. Pithole itself is gone. What it helped start is still very much present. Number 2. Hollidaysburg Reservoir and the abandoned canal infrastructure, Blair County. The Pennsylvania Canal System, which operated from the 1820s through the mid-19th century before being rendered obsolete by the railroads, left behind an extraordinary amount of physical infrastructure across the state. In Blair County, near Hollidaysburg, sections of the original canal bed, stone lock walls, and associated reservoir infrastructure remain in various states of preservation and abandonment. The canal system represented the state's most ambitious public works project of its era, a 395-mile network connecting Philadelphia to Pittsburgh that required the engineering solution of the Allegheny Portage Railroad to cross the mountains, a system of inclined planes that hauled canal boats up and over the Allegheny front on rail cars. It was, briefly, one of the engineering wonders of North America. The railroads made it irrelevant within decades of its completion. What the abandoned canal infrastructure hides is a labor history of considerable darkness. The canal was built largely by Irish immigrant workers, many of them recent arrivals fleeing poverty and famine conditions in Ireland, who took the work because there was little else available to them. The conditions were genuinely brutal. Workers lived in temporary shanty camps along the construction route, with inadequate sanitation and no medical infrastructure to speak of. Cholera swept through the canal work camps repeatedly during the construction years, killing workers by the score. Malaria from the wetland areas being drained and channeled for the canal added to the death toll. Construction accidents involving blasting and heavy equipment accounted for more. Along the route in Blair and neighboring counties, there are documented mass burial sites, areas where workers who died during construction were buried in unmarked graves near the work sites, because no one had the time, resources, or apparent inclination to do anything more formal. These were not men with local connections or family in Pennsylvania to advocate for them. They were transient laborers, treated as expendable inputs to a construction project, and when they died, they were buried where they fell, and the work continued. Some of these burial locations have been identified through historical research and oral tradition. Others remain unlocated. The towpaths that walkers use today pass within feet of ground that was, in the 1830s, a mass grave. There is no marker. There is no commemorative plaque. There is, usually, just the path and the trees. Number 1. Centralia's St. Ignatius Cemetery, Columbia County. Centralia gets 2 entries on this list because it earns them. While the town itself made number 11, the St. Ignatius Cemetery at the edge of what was Centralia deserves its own consideration. The cemetery is, by most measures, the last public space of the former town that is actively maintained. The church it served was demolished, the rectory is gone, the school is gone, and the vast majority of the buildings that made up the town have been razed by the state. But the cemetery remains, and the community of former Centralia residents and their descendants still tends it. What makes St. Ignatius Cemetery distinctly unsettling is its context. It sits at the edge of a landscape that has been fundamentally altered by 60-plus years of underground combustion. The ground around and beneath it has been subject to subsidence, heat, and gas infiltration. Pennsylvania has monitored the cemetery periodically for carbon monoxide and structural stability. Steam vents from the burning mine fire are visible within walking distance of the grave markers. The people buried in St. Ignatius lived in Centralia when it was a functioning coal town. Many of them worked in the mines that are now on fire beneath the ground. The fire itself, the one consuming what remains of the town, is burning through the coal seams that their labor and their fathers' and grandfathers' labor helped to map and exploit. There is a particular weight to a cemetery that sits above the consequences of the industry that define the community buried within it. Former resident John Lokitis Jr., who remained in Centralia for years after most of his neighbors left, once said simply that leaving would mean leaving everyone he knew who was already gone. The cemetery is still there. The fire is still burning underneath it. If this one stayed with you, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. Pennsylvania has more stories like these, and we are just getting started.